Starling was a complex figure, a man who ruled Raleigh with a lethal combination of charisma, fearlessness, and strategic acumen. A generational gangster, he operated with a code that was both ruthless and disciplined, embodying the tactics of the area's most infamous gangsters and kingpins, whose influence he had studied and refined. Starling was flashy to his core. His neon-colored supercars were as much a part of his persona as his loyalty to the heroin trade. Riding through the city in an unmistakable orange or yellow Lamborghini, he was a spectacle, both a warning and a symbol of untouchable power. He dared anyone, even the police, to cross him, and they never did. His enemies knew the cost of disrespect. Starling's law was simple and final: retaliation within 24 hours. By dawn, any opposition would be crushed, his rule asserted yet again. But beneath the flash and fire, Starling was a gentleman by his own moral code. He was unfailingly polite, never cursed around women, and abstained from smoking and drinking. He held himself to standards that might seem out of place for a drug lord, but it was this juxtaposition that made him so unique. Starling could be both suave and ruthless, cultured and violent. He could sit in a fine suit at an R&B lounge discussing music production with the same precision he applied to orchestrating heroin deals. His passion for music was genuine. He loved the artistry of R&B and dreamed of using it as his exit strategy. He poured his heart into music production, viewing it as a potential bridge to a legitimate life, a way to step out of the game without losing his power or presence. Music for Starling represented freedom. He envisioned an empire built not on heroin but on R&B hits, where his name would be celebrated rather than feared. Yet, he never deluded himself. He knew his enemies were many, his rivals eager to see him slip. The music industry was his only plan to leave the streets behind, but until that dream was realized, he would continue to rule his world unapologetically, balancing gentility with intimidation, always one step ahead and fully in control. Starling held an iron grip over the Mac Rogers housing projects, a fortress in Raleigh where he ruled with an unwavering authority. His influence extended to the most feared stick-up men and killers, a crew whose loyalty was rooted in both respect and fear. Starling's reputation kept his enemies at bay and his allies in line. He demanded loyalty, and few dared to challenge him. But Don was different. He walked into Starling's world with a fearlessness that caught Starling's attention. For Starling, this lack of fear was both admirable and inconvenient. On one hand, he respected Don's courage. There were few men in Raleigh who could look Starling in the eye without flinching. But Starling couldn't afford to let this show, not in front of his crew. Any hint of respect toward Don could be seen as a chink in his armor, so he crafted a carefully worded threat over the phone, warning Don to fall back whenever he was around. It was a soft threat, not intended to truly scare Don, but rather to save face with his crew. On the other end of the line, Ace, Starling's crony, laughed, playing the part of the loyal sidekick. But to Don, there was nothing funny about it. He understood the undercurrent in Starling's words, a mixture of genuine warning and a test of his resolve. Ace's behavior added another layer to the dynamic. Always on the edge, Ace showed his loyalty to Starling in passive, almost cowardly ways. His habit of adding Starling to personal calls without telling the other party was a regular occurrence, a way to ingratiate himself with Starling by letting him eavesdrop on conversations. Ace played the role of the watchful informant, willing to betray even his closest friends to stay in Starling's favor. In his mind, this was self-preservation, but to Starling, Ace's actions only underscored his weakness. While Starling tolerated Ace's antics, he knew Ace would never have Don's nerve. Ace might have been a useful pawn, but Don was something else entirely, a wild card who refused to be intimidated. The three-way call highlighted the tension in their relationships. Starling's authority was unshakable, but he knew Don's defiance was an anomaly, something his usual tactics couldn't tame. Meanwhile, Ace remained in the shadows, watching, scheming, and trying to stay on Starling's good side, even if it meant betraying everyone around him. Starling was a paradox, a blend of brutal, unyielding authority and unwavering loyalty to those he cared for, especially the women in his life. Coming from a deeply impoverished family in the South, he was no stranger to hardship. His roots ran thick from Durham to the deep South in Mississippi, a connection he honored by frequently returning to the SIP. There, he indulged in his passions, racing old-school muscle cars and placing hefty bets on horse races. Starling was undeniably country with a K, a rough-edged Southern man through and through. Despite his fierce reputation, there was an undeniable charm to him, especially when it came to women. He viewed Southern women as treasures, symbols of resilience and beauty, and anyone who disrespected them was an immediate enemy in his eyes. His loyalty to them was so deep that he'd eliminate any threat without hesitation, his ruthlessness making him both feared and revered in equal measure. Starling could be generous, even protective, but he had no tolerance for disrespect of any kind. A man who crossed him might never see another sunrise. The contradiction in Starling's character ran deep. He was known to be thoughtful and gentle with those he trusted, yet his mind held dark, calculated schemes. He operated by his own moral code, one that combined fierce loyalty with unbridled wrath. This balance of charm and violence, of loyalty and menace, kept even his closest associates on edge, knowing full well that the same man who could offer a comforting hand would just as easily pull the trigger. Ace and Starling were bonded from a young age, first meeting in school and quickly becoming close friends. While Ace had always been by Starling's side, he was one of many who held the position of a right hand. Starling had 5 other trusted associates, each running their own drug operations under his expansive Starling Family Syndicate (SFS), which operated under the guise of a music label. This label, known for its gritty talent, acted as both a front and a cover for the relentless drug activity and violence that the SFS spread throughout North and South Carolina. Starling's reputation was larger than life, and nowhere was this more evident than in Atlanta. He moved through the city like a mogul, displaying his wealth and influence as if he were richer than any of the rappers dominating the city's music scene. His opulent lifestyle and no-nonsense attitude impressed local kingpins and even cartels who saw him as a force to be reckoned with. Behind the glamour was a well-oiled machine. Starling kept North Carolina hitmen and women trained in setting up his enemies on retainer. Whether in Atlanta or back home in Durham, his reputation ensured that one disrespectful word could turn deadly. To Starling, revenge wasn't just about striking back. It was about making a statement. A simple assault was never enough to settle a score, not when a slight to SFS could demand blood. His response to any challenge or disrespect was swift, brutal, and often final. This ruthlessness made Starling both feared and respected in the South, a quality that endeared him to other powerful players who valued his fierce loyalty to his own. But beneath the intimidating facade was a complex figure. Those who knew Starling personally saw the other side of him, the smooth-talking, laughing man who was polite, gentle, and, surprisingly, a talented singer. He never cursed, maintaining a refined and almost old-school approach in his mannerisms. He loved to laugh and joke, especially with his closest friends and family. The duality made him an enigma, a man who could instill fear with a look, yet charm those around him with a warm laugh and gentle voice. The tales of Starling's charisma were legend, especially among the women who flocked to see him perform at the local club. His noir black Bentley, unmistakable and intimidating, would block the club entrance as a subtle show of dominance. Everyone knew Starling was in the building, and his presence alone could draw a crowd. But he wasn't just there for show. He was on a mission to find the best talent North Carolina had to offer. And when he found Big Bo, a raw and gritty local rapper, he knew he'd found something special. Late nights in the studio became routine. They'd record tracks, swap stories, and prank call SFS allies and rivals, sending out fake threats for laughs. With his reach, wealth, and loyal enforcers, Starling felt untouchable, and he was more than ready to squash any issues that dared surface. During one of these nights, Ace was lounging in the studio with him when Starling mentioned wanting a magazine cover, an ideal way to boost the reputation of SFS Records. Ace didn't hesitate, assuring Starling that he could arrange it without any problem. He had Don, his trusted friend, who ran a video magazine and had connections to make it happen. To strengthen his pitch, Ace threw in that Don was already under the protection of SFS and Ace Money Entertainment, though Don had no idea of the promises being made on his behalf. In Ace's mind, this was a natural extension of their bond. He'd protected Don through thick and thin. Yet, by associating Don with the heavyweights of SFS, Ace had tied him deeper into their world than Don could have anticipated. It was a world governed by Starling's ruthless sense of loyalty and strength, where every ally was under an implicit obligation. Ace knew that with Don on the SFS radar, his role in their empire would subtly shift, whether Don intended it or not. When Starling decided he wanted that magazine cover, he meant tonight. No waiting, no scheduling. He wanted it on his terms, and everyone was expected to comply. He turned to his main enforcer, Jay Guns, who had been with him through some of his most intense operations, knowing he'd help send a clear message of urgency. Starling told Ace to make it happen and directed him to meet up on Highway 55 at the La Quinta Hotel. There, under the neon lights of the parking lot, they'd set up for the shoot. Ace was under no illusion about the stakes here. Starling wasn't asking, he was demanding. Don had to show up, ready with his camera, or there'd be consequences. Ace immediately dialed Don, who was out on another job, catching him up on the situation. Trying to soften the urgency, Ace framed it as a prime opportunity for Don, but the message was clear: he needed to be there, and he needed to bring everything. The hotel was set to become the backdrop for an impromptu photo shoot, with Starling at the center, ready to solidify his legacy in the flash of Don's camera. Don had barely stepped into the parking lot with his camera before he sensed the weight of the situation. Starling was already set up in front of his sleek space black BMW 650 convertible, its top down and speakers blasting a new hard-hitting track that set the tone. Starling looked every bit the Southern kingpin. He was rumored to be a dark-skinned, slick-talking figure with a scar slicing across his right cheek and an intense, unwavering gaze. His voice, a deep Mississippi, Alabama drawl, commanded attention. He had a habit of repeating phrases with a stuttering edge that came off more like an intentional punctuation of authority than an actual speech quirk. To Don, it was clear. Starling had a PhD in street economics, and he was about to lecture. With Jay Guns managing the music and Starling in the spotlight, Ace nudged Don to start filming. Unsure but committed, Don raised his camera and began to capture what felt like a message meant for the entire city. Starling pulled a CD out of his jacket, a recording from M.O., one of North Carolina's most notorious artists and a gang-connected figure with his own territory. Starling sneered and declared, "This is what I think of M.O.," before slamming the CD onto the concrete and grinding it under a $1,000 Prada shoe. The message was loud and clear. Starling didn't just rule the music, he ruled the streets, and there was no room for competition. As Starling continued his rant, that stuttering cadence hit a deeper chord with Don, almost as if the declaration was directed at him. Starling was laying down his authority, letting Don and anyone else who might see this footage know that he ran the entire state of North Carolina, both in the music scene and in the drug game. In a sudden break, Ace's phone buzzed urgently, and he stepped aside to answer. One of his and Starling's trusted allies reported a drive-by at one of their heroin houses. Ace relayed the news quickly, and Starling's demeanor shifted from grandstanding to deadly focus. Without hesitation, he told Jay Guns to gather the crew, his plan set in an instant. The impromptu interview ended abruptly, and Ace pulled Don aside, signaling it was time to go. Within moments, they were back on the road, speeding away from the La Quinta lot as Starling's orders echoed in the night. As Ace drove them back into the city, Don's mind was racing, realizing how deeply embedded he had become in this dark, ruthless empire, an empire held together by Starling's power and his unbreakable hold over everyone in his orbit. Don's phone buzzed early, pulling him from his sleep. It was Ace, casually telling him to check out the Durham Herald online. As Don pulled up the page, the headline struck him like a slap: 3 dead in a deadly gang shooting. The incident had gone down around 1 a.m. on Angier Avenue, a chilling reminder of how close he was to this brutal underworld. Ace's tone on the phone was disturbingly casual, ending with a "have a blessed day" before laughing and hanging up. Don felt a wave of unease. He didn't know if he could trust Ace anymore. Ace was a smooth talker, always projecting a polished image, but Don had seen past the mask. He knew Ace feared Starling's ruthless control. That fear flickered in Ace's eyes when Starling wasn't watching. Starling, however, was another breed entirely. He saw potential in Don, even as a retired gangster now focused on his magazine, and he envied Don's influence, especially the connections his work was building. Starling kept a close watch on Don, partly because he secretly wished Don was on his personal team of enforcers, and partly because he saw a future threat. Starling knew that if he and Ace didn't keep tabs on him, Don's magazine could grow powerful enough to pose a real challenge. Starling was the ultimate chess player, ruthless and calculating. He didn't believe in just a double cross. He aimed for the triple. His method was brutal efficiency. He'd sell a brick of heroin to a dealer, then send J-guns to follow the buyer, rob them, and return the brick back to Starling's stockpile. It was a ruthless cycle, and while it didn't always go smoothly, with some dealers resisting and ending up dead, Starling saw it as just part of the game. Despite his deadly methods, Starling kept a tight leash on his organization, protecting his core men like Ace, who led the family operations under the SFS umbrella. But Ace's anxiety about Starling's influence was unmistakable to Don. He was realizing, as he pieced together the moves and schemes, that he was surrounded by people who'd do anything to keep him close, and even more to keep him controlled. When the artist from Florida came to Durham, the scene at the bowling alley unraveled fast. Ace, trying to show hospitality, stepped in with Don filming, hoping to capture the night for the magazine. But the young locals, who ran the city's underworld, took his presence as an insult. Tension crackled, and in an instant, a group surrounded Ace, landing a hit across his head. Don, stunned, continued filming, but kept his distance, watching the young bosses display their dominance. As Ace retreated toward the arcade doorway, the young men began taunting him, ordering him to take off his SFS jacket, claiming it was a mark of disrespect in their territory. Ace held his ground, insisting on the power of SFS, but the threats continued. When they made it outside, 2 armed young men confronted them, sparing Don and ordering him to keep filming, while they taunted Ace to take off his jacket. The sudden arrival of a police car disrupted the confrontation, giving Ace just enough time to escape in his BMW, yelling for Don to hurry. Ace was rattled, but Don was lost in thought, trying to piece together why they'd spared him. Was it the magazine's influence, his connections, or perhaps the Southside boss's recognition? Ace immediately called Otis, then Starling, recounting every detail. By morning, Starling called Don and Ace, making light of the attack. He was amused, more curious if Ace had kept the jacket on than about the beating itself. Starling brushed off the young Southside bosses as petty thugs, mocking Ace's panic, and hung up, leaving them both with a reminder of his dominance. Don reached out to the Florida rapper, who was still shaken from the chaos he'd seen and from a shooting at a club he performed at the previous night. Don revealed it was all tied to Ace's circle, a revelation that deepened the rapper's fear of Durham's wild cowboys. He didn't know, though, that Starling had orchestrated it all, sending a clear message that no one threatened his organization without consequence. But karma circled back. Only a month later, Starling's empire crumbled as the feds swept through, locking down his entire operation in tandem with a raid on Ace Money Entertainment. Both Starling and Ace's empires, once formidable forces in the streets, were brought down in a single, devastating strike, reminding everyone that even the most powerful syndicates had their limits. To be continued.